So we will record it so don't miss out. And if you need it to be shared with you, please let me know, and I can share the recording with you. The slides also will be available after this session, and then we'll have the slides for the second half after the next week's 2 sessions. Please do ask questions. If anything at all is unclear, if you get lost in terminology or you can't quite get a point, please do ask. Nobody is judging here anyone on what they know or don't know. The whole point of training is to tell you something you don't know or to reinforce the knowledge you already have or to confirm it, but the questions drive this training. We want to give you information that you need and that you will use. So if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to ask. You can ask them here. If they crop up in your mind later, you can email them to me and I can pass them on to John, so that we can get them answered. And if there are particular areas you want to focus on, also let us know, and we'll talk about that. Thank you very much. So John, are you ready to start?
Yeah, absolutely.
All right, well, let's begin.
Okay, great. Thank you very much, Paulina, and a very warm welcome to everyone. Great to be with you all again. So just before we start today's session, any questions at all from yesterday? Anything kept you awake last night or gave you nightmares, or made you smile or laugh? Anything at all? Okay. So let me just share my screen. Oh, incidentally, just in terms of the format today. I think yesterday the first session was a bit long. We had the break quite late in the day. So today we're going to have the break at around 2:30. I mean, I'm not going to say exactly because we need to find a natural point to stop, but it'll be around 2:30. We'll have a half an hour break. And my aim today, the subject is Incoterms. I hope I'm not wrong on this occasion, but that always elicits questions, comments, lots of discussion. So my aim is to try and, if you like, finish talking by 4 o'clock UK time at the latest, leaving a full half hour for Q&A at the end, maybe even a bit more than that if we can. We'll see how it goes. So let me share my screen. Okay, can I just check if someone can tell me, can you see the screen, please, in full size?
I can see it.
Yeah, okay, you've got it. Great. So this session is Incoterms 2020. Incoterms are the core of every international trade contract. Get the Incoterm right, and the contract is likely to go well. Get it wrong, and disputes are likely to be extremely expensive. It's as simple as that. So, it really is an important subject. And I always say to people, when we kind of run these training courses covering all the elements of supply chains, if there's one, if you just want one takeaway from it, the takeaway should be the correct use of Incoterms. It really is crucial. And I think I mentioned yesterday that virtually every international trade contract globally is intended to be covered by Incoterms, but it's estimated that about 70 to 80% of the time an inappropriate term or a wrong term is being used, which is quite a worry. So there we go. The current version, as you probably know, is Incoterms 2020. And, things move very, very quickly. We're now in 2025. And I think it was only last week I was approached by the International Chamber of Commerce to start thinking about what Incoterms 2030 is going to look like. Because when we review Incoterms, and not always, the last 3 revisions of Incoterms, I've been part of the review body, but it's a long process before a new version comes into play. It takes 3 or 4 years of consulting with every country in the world, anyone who wants to get involved in the review process. It's a long consultation period before we actually come up with the revised version. So there will be an Incoterms 2030. A bit later on, I'll talk a little bit more about the review process and how it works. I have to show you that I'm legally authorised to teach Incoterms. Unfortunately, globally, there is so much bad and incorrect teaching of Incoterms that the International Chamber of Commerce decided that you now have to be licensed to teach it. So legally, I have to show you that I do have my accreditation to teach Incoterms. You can see it on the screen. I have passed the exam, you'll be pleased to know. It was a horrible exam, but fortunately I passed it. There we go. So that was the previous version. Some of you may recognize the branding, and of course that is the current version. I mean, let's do a shout out on this. Just shout yes if you've got the Incoterms book. This book here, the one you can see on the screen. Shout yes if you have it in your offices.
Yes.
Great, there was one yes there. I'm hoping there's going to be a few more. Okay, well, look, all I would say at this stage is that is the book you cannot do without. There is only one correct version of Incoterms, and that's what you find in that book. If you Google Incoterms, you will get the biggest load of rubbish ever. You know, it's one of the very, very big issues. Even the biggest shipping line in the world, I'm not going to name them, you all know who they are. The biggest shipping line in the world, they put Incoterms on their website, they have got it wrong. The only true source is the Incoterms publication. So we'll come back to that a bit later. But, you know, frankly, anyone involved in international trade needs that book. There's no alternative. You need the book. That is the reference for Incoterms. So anyway, what's it all about? It stands for International Commercial Terms. First version came out in 1936. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. And it tends to get revised, or it does get revised now about every 10 years. There's no law that says it has to be revised every 10 years, but that's been the pattern since 1980. We've had an Incoterms 1980, 1990, 2020, 2010, 2020, and there will be an Incoterms 2030. So it does get revised every 10 years at the moment. Is it an international legal requirement to use Incoterms in every contract? No, except for one exception. The only exception is in Ukraine, public procurement law says Incoterms have to be used for public procurement. But no other country has a legal requirement in their legislation to use Incoterms. Having said that, of course, the reality is that once you put an Incoterm in your contract, then both sides, seller and buyer, are legally bound by that Incoterm. So even though, apart from public procurement in Ukraine, no one says you have to use Incoterms, once you put them in the contract, you are bound by the Incoterms rules as enshrined in the Incoterms book. Does it make sense to use Incoterms in every contract? Yes, it does. And most people, you know, it's been estimated. I mean, you know, as I mentioned yesterday, statistics can be difficult, they can be misleading. But it's estimated that about 98% of world trade is intended to be under Incoterms. Although sometimes, even though the traders think it's under Incoterms, it isn't, because they haven't mentioned the word Incoterm in the contract, and therefore they're not protected by Incoterms. But it's estimated the intention is 98% of world trade is under Incoterms. But as I mentioned earlier on, a huge proportion of that, an inappropriate Incoterm, may be being used. Does it make sense to use Incoterms in every contract? Absolutely yes, because it's an international standard. It's a global standard. If you like, it provides the language for an international trade contract. And that's a really good way to look at Incoterms as the language for any international trade contract. Current version is Incoterms 2020. As I've mentioned, there will be, you know, going by the 10-year rule, and also because the ICC have announced it to people like me, they announced it a few weeks ago, there will be an Incoterms 2030. There will be a review process, which will probably start working on that, I would imagine, next year, because it takes 3 or 4 years to do an Incoterms review. So what's it all about? Let me just go back. So, the history is actually quite interesting, and the history tells you how it all came about. So, if we think back to the 1920s, all those years ago, over a century ago, the First World War had come to an end. And there was a view globally that if countries are trading with each other, they won't be fighting with each other. After the First World War, they called it the war to end all wars. And there really was this view that if countries trade with each other, they won't fight with each other. Nice idea. We can look back and say, well, it hasn't really worked very well, but that was the view at the time. So in the 1920s, the International Chamber of Commerce was established, but they didn't really have a role. You can imagine what it was like. They're established, they've got their headquarters in Paris, which they still have. And basically, they're told you're an international organization. Your role is very simple. Your role is to facilitate international trade. Those three words are three words we hear a lot nowadays: facilitate international trade. But there's nothing new in that. That's what they were told their role was. So you can imagine, new international organization, they're sitting at their office in Paris, they're told that's what your role is: facilitate international trade. They didn't have a clue what to do or where to start. Can you imagine how hard the research must have been? No internet, no phone, no long distance phones, communications really difficult. You couldn't fly anywhere, really, really hard to discuss things. So they had a very, very difficult job and they didn't know what to do. And it took them quite a while to really have a look at the international trading environment and what it involved. And it took them a while, but one of their takeaways, and their most important takeaway, was they discovered that, not surprisingly, international trade contracts were huge, huge documents because there were no standards in international trade. So if you're an exporter and you've got 10 customers overseas in one country or in 10 different countries, every single contract would be different. You would negotiate it and the terms and conditions would be different for every contract. Every detail of the transaction would have to go into the contract. So even for the most simple, low value sale of goods across a border, a contract would typically be 100, 200 pages, typically. Even if the value was very low. So the ICC, the International Chamber of Commerce, they decided that actually a really good intervention they could have would be to develop standard trading conditions, standard ways of trading. And if the seller and buyer agreed to use one of these standard ways of trading, they didn't have to have huge contracts. All they had to do would be to write down in their contract the 3-letter code for one of those standards. And then all the seller and buyer would have to do is they wouldn't have to put everything in the contract. They would just refer to the book, which would have a definition of what that code means. And those codes became known as Incoterms, International Commercial Terms. And the first version of Incoterms came out in 1936. It took them a while to get it together. And there were 3 standard ways of trading initially. And they were called FOB, CFR, or at the time it's called C&F, not CFR, FOB, C&F, and CIF. Those were the 3 standards. And they published the book. And in that book, for those 3 standard ways of trading, FOB, C&F, and CIF, there would be an absolute definition of what those terms mean for the seller and what they mean for the buyer. And what that meant was, as long as they put one of those terms in the contract, they could cut a contract from being 100 pages, for example, to being 10 pages or 5 pages, because everything else was in the Incoterms book. And nothing has changed since. Well, no, I shouldn't say nothing has changed. A lot has changed since then. But, in terms of the way it works, nothing has changed since then. Basically, in your contract, you put an Incoterm, and then everything you need to know is in the Incoterms book. If you've got an FCA contract, you look up FCA in the book. I'm just trying to briefly find it. And that will tell you everything you need to know. about what's involved in that contract. So basically, what you end up with are standard ways of trading. Now, when you have standard international rules, yesterday we spoke a lot about rules-based systems for customs valuations, for rules of origin, and so on and so on. When you have a rules-based system, there are really two ways of putting the rules together. One way is you can simply say to international traders, you can say, okay, here are the rules, here are the Incoterms rules, here's the book, follow the rules. That's one way of doing it. When 2030 comes, we could say, okay, here's Incoterms 2030, everyone, follow the rules. That's one way of doing it. That would be a quick and easy way to do it. The other way to do it is you look at what really happens on the ground in an international trade contract. How the contract is performed, how the goods are shipped, how they're paid for, how they're insured, the risks involved, the amount of risk a seller is prepared to take, the amount of risk a buyer is prepared to take. And you design the rules based on the way things really happen on the ground. Because things change day by day, month by month, year by year. And actually, it's the second concept that we do with Incoterms. We don't just get together as a group because Incoterms are international, every country has an involvement in the review, but we don't just all get together and say, let's make these changes. We have a huge consultation process globally. And anyone involved in international supply chains, exporters, importers, freight forwarders, customs brokers, banks, insurance companies, customs agencies, ministries of trade, standards ministries, everyone involved in the international supply chain can make comments. They can make suggestions about changes they want to see in Incoterms reflecting current practice. And that's how the reviews take place. We look at current practice, we take views from every country in the world, and then we do 3 drafts before we come to the final version. The final version is ratified by lawyers, and then it's translated into different languages. It's a long, long process. I've been involved in the last 3 reviews of Incoterms, Incoterms 2000, Incoterms 2010, and Incoterms 2020. After I got involved with Incoterms 2000, I said to myself, never again. You spend hours and hours and hours discussing the most simple, basic point in the basement of the ICC in Paris, involving lots of people from different countries. It takes ages to get to any conclusions. And after Incoterms 2000, I said, I will never do this again. And then I got involved in Incoterms 2010. Then I said, I will never do this again. And then I got involved in Incoterms 2020. And I think I'm probably going to be doing it for Incoterms 2030 because they've asked me. So we'll see how that goes. But essentially, it's quite right that it's done that way. It needs to be a long and inclusive process. So we have regular revisions of Incoterms, and that's because things change so quickly in international trade. And when we do a review of Incoterms, what we do is, because the format or the timescales at the moment is Incoterms are reviewed every 10 years. So when a new version comes out, it has to be valid for the next 10 years. Incoterms are never amended in the interim. You get Incoterms 2020, the next one will be Incoterms 2030. There's no changes in between. Those rules have got to last 10 years without being changed. So when we do the review, we look at what has changed in international trade over the previous 10 years. That's the easy bit, because it's happened. What has changed over the last 10 years, and we make sure we make any technical adjustments based on changes that have happened in the previous 10 years. That's the easy bit. But then we have to predict what could happen in the next 10 years. So, when we did Incoterms 2020, we knew they would have to last till 2030. So we would have to consider what could happen in the intervening period and make sure that the terms remain fit for purpose during their validity. And that's harder because you never know what's going to happen. So the review process is long. And when you look at the updates, when you look at the reviews, as you can see in the third point on the screen at the moment, and just to give you a little bit of background, so the first version was 1936. 1953 background was basically so that Incoterms would work for air freight. Because before that, it was very, very unusual for cargoes to be shipped commercially by air. It was actually the Berlin airlift. That's what put air freight on the scene as a way of moving cargoes around the world, apart from for military use. So 1953, that revision was really all about making Incoterms fit for air freight, as well as sea freight and road and rail. That's what the 53 revision was all about. 1967 it was cosmetic changes, no major changes, but cosmetic changes to make Incoterms easier to use. Then the big thing with 1976 and 1980, the big thing there, of course, was containerization. So during the 70s, containerization came in, the use of standard size containers on container ships. And it was suddenly realized that the traditional Incoterms like FOB, CFR, CIF did not work if the goods are in containers. You can't use FOB, CFR, CIF if the goods are in containers. And that was recognized round about 1980. So a big revision in 1980 to make it clear to everyone that if the goods are in containers, you can't use FOB, FAS, CFR, CIF. It doesn't work if the goods are in containers. And that's still an issue. We still get importers and exporters using those terms when the goods are in containers. So that's what the 1976 and 1980 revision was all about. 1990, again, was mainly cosmetic changes and quite a lot of changes in the D group terms. I'll be talking about the individual terms later on. So 1990, again, mainly cosmetic, but some changes mainly with the D group Incoterms. Then 2000, the big thing in 2000 was there was a belief that shortly after 2000, by around about 2005, paper documents would be out. Everyone would be using electronic messages instead of paper documents. So in Incoterms 2000, there was a huge emphasis on the fact that traders, importers and exporters, if they wish, they could agree to use electronic messages instead of paper documents, with a view, as I've mentioned, that by 2005, no one would be using paper anymore. How wrong we were. That was entirely wrong. And it was suddenly realized that actually this migration to electronic messages instead of paper documents was not going to happen by 2005. We're now in 2025 and it still hasn't happened. So, the review teams don't always get it right, but that was the belief at the time. Then the 2010 revision. The 2010 revision, there was a reduction in the number of terms. Up till 2000, there were 14 Incoterms. It was too many, and the International Chamber of Commerce recognized that. So they tasked us with finding a way to reducing the number of terms, and we reduced them from 14 terms to 11 terms. The reductions were mainly in the D group terms. As I said, I'll look at all the individual terms a bit later on. So that's what the 2010 revision was all about, and actually quite a big change with FOB, CFR and CIF. 2020, there were, what you tend to get when there's a review of Incoterms, you tend to get maybe 3 or 4 very major fundamental changes and lots and lots and lots of smaller changes. And certainly that's what happened in 2020. So in 2020, the big change was in insurance requirements for CIP and CIF. That was the really big change in 2020. Some other smaller changes, another big change, we changed one of the D terms from DAT to DPU, and some smaller cosmetic changes as well. 1 or 2 quite small changes, but big impact, which I'll talk about later on. And, as I say, we haven't started talking about Incoterms 2030 yet, but, probably towards the end of next year, probably about the middle of next year, the groups will start to get together to look at what changes may be needed in the run up, or, as we review Incoterms and come up with a draft of what Incoterms 2030 should actually look like. So they do get updated very regularly, or every 10 years, which, is fairly regularly. And the whole idea is to make sure they reflect current practice and anticipated future practice, because they have to be workable 10 years after they've been published. So let me just put this in. Oops. So what's it all about? And the key thing here is the acronym DROC, D-R-O-C, DROC. You can see that in the first bullet point. Incidentally, it was quite funny because last year I was doing quite a lot of teaching in some of the Southeast African countries, in Zambia, Zimbabwe, South Africa, Mozambique, Malawi. I did a kind of roadshow around those countries. And Incoterms was one of the key subjects. And what I learned very, very quickly, I think the first country I did the training in was in Zambia. I arrived in Zambia first, yeah. So it was in Lusaka in Zambia. And I was talking about Incoterms, and I mentioned the acronym DROC, and I saw loads of confused faces in the room. I looked around the room and I could see people looking very, very confused, and I wasn't sure why. I thought to myself, I'm clearly not explaining this very well. I need to do better on this. And then before I had a chance to kind of roll back a bit and find a different way of explaining it, a gentleman got up, and in Zambia they're very, very polite, and when you do face-to-face training, until I told them to relax and not to do it, if they wanted to ask a question they would stand up to ask the question. And anyway, this guy stood up and he said, please could you explain what has this got to do with DROC? And I said, okay, let me explain that again. And he said, because we don't understand, what has this got to do with the Democratic Republic of Congo? And then it suddenly hit me, of course, in that region, when you talk about DROC as an acronym, it's Democratic Republic of Congo. But that's not what it means in the Incoterms context. It means delivery, risk, obligation, cost. And those are the four purposes of Incoterms. And that's an easy way to remember them, by the acronym DROC. So D for delivery. Again, we'll expand on these a bit later on, but just to start off, with an overview. Okay, so delivery. And that means we need to define the exact point where the goods are legally delivered from the seller to the buyer. And that links with risk, because the point at which the goods are legally delivered, that's where the risk of the goods getting lost, stolen, damaged, pilfered, water damage, anything bad happening to them, that's where the risk passes from the seller to the buyer. So the D is the legal delivery point. And one of the key things which I hope you'll draw out of the training today is that, as long as, from the seller's point of view, as long as you don't use an Incoterm beginning with the letter D, you legally deliver when you dispatch the goods, not when they arrive. Okay? Legal delivery if the Incoterm begins with the letter E, F, or C, you legally deliver when the goods are dispatched. And that can be confusing, because if you're talking about a C group Incoterm, CPT, CIP, CFR, CIF, the seller has got to get the goods to the agreed arrival point. However, the seller legally delivers on dispatch, not when they reach that arrival point. So it can get a little bit confusing. But the delivery point, the legal delivery point, links with when the risk passes from the seller to the buyer. So every Incoterm, there are 11 terms. For each one of them, all we do is we look in the book, and that would tell us where the goods are legally delivered. And that will also align with where the risk passes from seller to buyer. The O is for obligation. In every supply chain, there are lots of activities going on. There are lots of obligations, and we need to know what the seller is obliged to do and what the buyer is obliged to do. It's not guesswork. We need to be absolutely clear, no grey areas. What are the seller's obligations? Who loads the container when it arrives at the warehouse? It's not always as it seems. Who has the risk of doing that? And who has the obligation of doing it? Who arranges international transportation? Who arranges domestic transportation? Who arranges export customs clearance? Who arranges export security clearance? Who loads the goods at the port? Who unloads them from the aircraft on arrival? Who pays the duty on arrival? Who does import customs clearance? Who applies for the export license? It's not always as it seems. So we need to have absolute clarity. What are the seller's obligations under each of the 11 terms? And what are the buyer's obligations under each of the 11 terms? And then finally, in a supply chain, for each activity, there's going to be a cost. Even if it's just producing documents, there's a cost in doing that. So who pays the cost? The seller or the buyer? We can't have guesswork. Otherwise, we would have a huge number of disputes. So for each of the 11 terms, it's very, very clear in Incoterms what the seller has to pay for and what the buyer has to pay for. So for each of the 11 terms, it's made absolutely clear, no grey areas. It's made it very, very clear where the goods are legally delivered, where the risk of something bad happening to the goods passes from seller to buyer, what the seller has to do under the contract, and what the buyer has to do under the contract in relation to obligations, and in relation to cost, what the seller has to pay for and what the buyer has to pay for. So as long as Incoterms are correctly incorporated in the contract, it should really cut down the necessity for disputes. And it does. It really does, as long as an appropriate Incoterm has been used. Because everything you need to know, as long as you put Incoterms into the contract, everything you need to know in relation to seller's obligation, seller's risk, seller's cost, buyer's obligation, buyer's risk, buyer's cost, everything is in the Incoterms book. You simply look up the term in the book, and we'll have a look at what it looks like a bit later on, and that will tell you everything you need to know. So let me pause there. Any questions, any comments so far? Okay. So, global misunderstanding of Incoterms, sadly, but there is. And this is global. It's no one particular country getting it wrong. I find this in every country where I go to train people. And to be honest, globally, the subject I'm asked to teach more than any other subject is actually Incoterms, because I think there's a growing view that, it is misunderstood. And, these kind of horror stories, you hear them everywhere. There are some examples there. Now, the middle one is quite interesting. And there's lots of, there's something wrong with all of these that you can see on the screen at the moment. But the middle one is interesting. There was one company I went into to do some consultancy for them, and they were a huge company. And I'm not going to mention the name, it would be wrong to do that. But to give you an indication of their size, they make all the packaging for McDonald's, love them or hate them, McDonald's hamburgers. They do all the packaging for McDonald's in Europe. They make all the packaging. And I went to do some training for them. They wanted their whole of their export department to be trained. So I went in there. They gave me an example of their price list. And the middle bullet point is what it said. It showed for each type of product they made, it gave a unit price, FOB, and a unit price, CFR, and it gave the same price. Now, you can't have that, as you'll see later on. I recognize not all of you may be familiar with Incoterms, but as you'll see later on, that it can't be the same price, because an FOB price would not include international transport, but a CFR price would include international transport. So a CFR price is always going to be higher than an FOB price. That was the first thing that was wrong. The second thing that was wrong is that FOB and CFR can only be used for bulk, non-container sea freight. And they were always, like most organizations now, they were always shipping their cargoes in containers. And if they're shipped in containers, you can't use FOB and CFR. And this was a huge, huge organization. So the reason I mention that is, don't think it's only the smaller kind of organizations that get it wrong, because that's not the case. Very, very often it's the multinationals as well. I was it was a few months ago now. I was speaking at one of the automotive industry's international conferences, their trade organization. They have several, but one of their trade organizations' international conferences. And I was talking about supply chain disruption in general. The subject of Incoterms came up, and it wasn't really the subject of what I was talking about, but the subject came up. And so, there was a question which I answered. And one of the biggest automotive companies, the biggest car producers in the world, recognized suddenly from what I told them in answer to their question, that they had been getting Incoterms wrong for 40 years. So the reason I make that point is because sometimes people say to me, maybe it's just the smaller organizations that get them wrong. It's not the case at all. It really isn't. There's a huge global problem in the application of Incoterms, and that problem isn't dependent on the size of the organization. It really isn't. It can be a micro company, one or two people, or it can be a multinational car manufacturer. There's a lot of misinformation around, sadly. And the point is, the contract may not be all it's seen. So in our contracting, we spoke a bit yesterday in general about what the contents of a contract should look like. And it's so important to get the contract absolutely watertight as best as we can, because the contract may not be all it seems. Look at the picture you can see on the screen at the moment. No bill of lading is going to tell you that's the way the containers are being delivered to the port. It's not going to say that. You won't know that from the bill of lading. But if you've got material in one of those containers, you've got a metal in one of those containers, would you be happy about it if you hold the risk? And you would certainly want to know in that contract if you have the risk. So by using Incoterms, we can control these things. We can actually mitigate risk in our contracts. Because, international trade is risky. There's a lot that can go wrong. There's a huge amount that can go wrong. From my point of view, I would say that's what makes international trade exciting. Other people may have different expressions they would use about that, but there's a huge amount that can go wrong. So when there's a review of Incoterms, as I've mentioned, we always look at what's new in the international trade environment. What is new? What's happened in the previous 10 years, which may trigger a change that we need to make in the next review of Incoterms, and what could happen, or what's on the agenda for the coming years. And that helps us come up with a final version of Incoterms which is fit for purpose. And these are just some examples of things that were new that we had to bear in mind in the Incoterms review. So things like the trusted trader regimes, which many of you will know. I'll talk more about this next week. But under the World Customs Organization, the SAFE framework of standards, the world is now divided between trusted traders and those who have not been accredited as trusted traders. The world is divided. It's purely voluntary to be a trusted trader. It's a good thing to be, but we'll talk about that next week. But this was a new protocol. It was absolutely new, and it's incorporated in different ways in different countries. So, in most countries, certainly in the European Union, in the UK, we call it AEO, Authorized Economic Operator. And that's a really good qualification for a trader to have, because they're given customs privileges. For those of you in the States, you're probably aware, it's called CTPAT. You guys in the States like it to be a bit more dramatic, I think. So in the States, it's not called AEO, Authorized Economic Operator. It's called the Customs and Trade Partnership Against Terrorism, Bit more dramatic, but the point is the same. It's all about supply chain security. That's what it's all about, trusted trader regimes. And these were something new some years ago. So we had to consider, did that trigger a change in Incoterms? We had big discussions about that. In the end, we decided it didn't trigger a change in the next version of Incoterms. But that's the kind of thing that we had to look at. We had to do a kind of sanity check to see if changes were necessary because of an important new regime that was coming into play. Certainly something that was new, and this is, these are things which aren't really, or this was something which wasn't really a cliff edge change. But over the years, we've seen a gradual change in the way goods are shipped globally. So, when I started my career, as I always say, in those days when I had hair on my head, when my career started, it was, the normal thing when you were shipping goods around the world, it would be port to port shipping, airport to airport, freight forwarder to freight forwarder. Nowadays, people want door-to-door logistics. Smart intermodal logistics solutions are becoming the way of the world. Now, because of that, it didn't really trigger changes in Incoterms, but it did trigger changes in the detail on some of the terms to make sure that they worked where they had to work for door-to-door shipping and multimodal shipping as much as they work for one mode of shipping, port to port, airport to airport, freight yard to freight yard. So smart intermodal logistics solutions, that's pretty important. Insurance clauses, we have standard insurance clauses globally. Again, we'll look at those next week. Those are called the Institute Cargo Clauses, and they change from time to time. They get fine-tuned from time to time. So whenever there's an Incoterms review, we have to make sure that the insurance requirements of Incoterms, there are two Incoterms where insurance is compulsory, CIP and CIF. The clue is in the I. If there's an I in the Incoterm, it is compulsory that the cargo is insured. Okay, and there's only two terms where it's compulsory, CIP and CIF. So we have to make sure for CIP and CIF that what we put in Incoterms aligns with the standard Institute Cargo Clauses. And what we'll talk about later and what you'll see later on is that there is a very, very big fundamental change in this in Incoterms 2020, a fundamental change in insurance requirements. Now, later on, I'm going to talk about what Incoterms don't cover, because again, there's a lot of misinformation there. And even though they don't cover payment, the place, the method, the currency of payment, they can have an impact on payments. Because many companies now, very, and this is global, many companies now, what they do is, what their accounts departments do, is exporters recognize revenue at the point where the goods are legally delivered under the Incoterm prevailing in the contract. So they link the Incoterm, the legal delivery point, not the physical delivery point, the legal delivery point, with the stage at which revenue can be recognized. So even though Incoterms don't impact on the method, time, or currency of payment, they've got to align with them again. And particularly, they've got to align with the letter of credit rules, UCP 600. And actually, again, there's quite a fundamental change that we made in Incoterms 2020, because there was a gap that we've known about for a while, but no one knew what to do about it. In Incoterms 2020, we found a solution which we've incorporated in the terms. I'll talk more about that later. And of course, nowadays, and we spoke about this a little bit yesterday, the world is dependent on global value chains. Every country is import dependent to some extent. Remember that number I gave you yesterday? The cup of Starbucks coffee comes from goods and services of 27 different countries. Okay, and that just gives you an idea of what we mean by global value chains. So we live in a world of global value chains. We have to do a sanity check every time there's a review of the terms to make sure each term incorporated in Incoterms does work under the umbrella, if you like, of a global value chain. As I mentioned, in Incoterms 2000, there was a view that by 2005, we would all be using electronic messages instead of paper documents. And we were absolutely 100% wrong. That migration to e-commerce has not happened. In international trade, it's happened in many other things, like banking, like shopping, and so on. But international trade is still largely reliant on paper documents. So we keep an eye on this, but in Incoterms 2010, when it was realized that this transition wasn't going to be quick, and we realized the same thing in 2020, we've really condensed the wording in relation to using electronic documents instead of paper documents. And again, I'll talk more about that later. So we've kept it really simple, because the view now is, and I know we're going to be talking about this again in the 2030 review, but the view now is that the migration to e-commerce is going to be really, really slow. And there are reasons for that. I mean, just briefly, the basic reason for that is, it's all very, very well to say, okay, we're going to issue electronic messages instead of paper documents. But if the country that you're selling to doesn't recognize electronic messages instead of paper documents under their law, then you can't do it. And again, some people think it's only kind of in the developing countries where this is an issue, but it's not the case. It was only last year in the UK that we had an electronic documents bill of parliament. We weren't legally allowed to use electronic documents up till last year. And even though in the UK we do now have that Act of Parliament saying we can do it, if the countries that we're selling to can't do it because they don't have that legislation, then you've still got to use paper documents. Okay, so we always look at risk. And it's interesting because, in a way, I was going to say risk is a soft subject. Of course, it's not a soft subject, but, it's not so much a practical thing. But when we look at risk is important under Incoterms, because in each of the 11 Incoterms, we look at the risk of the seller and we look at the risk of the buyer. So we do a sanity check when there's a review of Incoterms. Has risk gone up? And, we can link this with payments that we're going to talk about next week when we look at export credit control. We can't just think about the commercial risk, which is the risk that the buyer won't pay us. That's only a small element of the risk. We've got banking risk, we've got country risk, we've got sovereign risk, we've got political risk. We have to think of all those things when we're talking about an international trade. So we always look at that because that keeps our feet on the ground when we're looking at any changes we make to the terms. Would that change give more risk to the seller or to the buyer? And is that likely to be acceptable or not? Those are the kind of things that we look at. Regional groupings. There are so many regional groupings in the world now. In the Americas, you've got the US, Mexico, Canada trade agreement. Not too sure what's going to happen with that, but the agreement is kind of still there. We've got the European Union, we've got ECOWAS in West Africa, we've got ASEAN in Southeast Asia, we've got Mercosur in South America, we've got the GCC in the Middle East, and so on and so on and so on. We've got lots of these groupings. So we have to make sure that Incoterms work for trades within the groupings as much as outside them. And what I mean by that is, for example, within the European Union, the EU is a customs union. And that means that there's no import duty on most cargoes traded within the European Union. So when Incoterms covers a contract between two EU countries, under the Incoterm, traditionally it would say, depending on the term, it would say either the seller or the buyer pays import duty. But if you're trading within the EU, there's no import duty. So we simply added the words, the seller or the buyer pays import duty where applicable. Because if the trade is within a free trade area or within a customs union, or there's a trade agreement, there would be no duty payable. So you can't say seller or buyer must pay import duty. You say where applicable, because there may not be any import duty within an economic grouping. Then we have the US commercial code. So for our friends in the US today, you guys confuse things for us. The US has, under the American foreign trade definitions, they have a group of trade terms which look like Incoterms, they smell like Incoterms, they taste like Incoterms, they use the same acronym as Incoterms, they have a completely different meaning. Okay, and later on I'll give you one example. I'll show you the difference between FOB, US Commercial Code, and FOB Incoterm. It's a completely different meaning. Now, this is an issue. There's a reason for it, which I'll talk about. The reason is, and you know, what I should say is that I think gradually in the USA, and you guys in the US may want to make some comments on this, gradually I think in the US, I've been seeing a migration away from the American foreign trade definitions in international contracts to using Incoterms. There is a gradual move to using Incoterms, but you know, when for the International Chamber of Commerce, this is a big deal to try and completely once and for all get away from the American foreign trade definitions, because it can cause confusion with trades with the USA. The reason for it is because, you know, and you guys in the US, please correct me and please comment if you think I'm wrong, because I may be. But I think, you know, generally when these things are discussed, what comes out of it is the US needs a set of trade terms that work for trade between states. Because, you know, to some extent, and I've heard this from a lot of my American friends, you know, who are in trading, and they would say to me, well, actually, you know, when you've got a trade between two states, a lot of people in the States would look on that as being an export, even though, you know, it's not outside the US border, because you can have different regulations in different states. It would kind of be looked upon as being an export. So because of that, the US says we need to have our own commercial code. Now, okay, that's all well and good when it's used internally within the US, but it causes confusion when it's used on contracts between the US and other countries. So, you know, and rather unkindly, I think, whenever there's a review of Incoterms, you know, the terminology is they always say there is a problem with the US commercial code, it causes confusion. I don't think it does cause confusion as long as there's clarity in contracts, that contracts are according to Incoterms and not the American foreign trade definitions. You know, it's very, very easy to be clear about it. You just make sure you have the word Incoterms in the contract, and then there's no confusion. The only way you get confusion is when it doesn't state Incoterms, it doesn't state American foreign trade definitions. There's an assumption it's according to Incoterms. The trade is with the US. The party in the US thinks it's American foreign trade definitions. The party outside the US thinks it's Incoterms, and you end up with total confusion. That's what the issue is there. Then we have natural disasters. You may think, what's that got to do with Incoterms? Well, the thing, of course, is that if the contract is under a D group Incoterm, under a D group Incoterm, the seller takes all the risk until the goods are arrived and have been receipted by the buyer or by the agent of the buyer. If the goods never arrive, then they have never been legally delivered and the buyer never has to pay for them, if it's a D group Incoterm. Now, there's a big issue there. You know, from the seller's point of view, there's always a huge risk of using a D group Incoterm. And what I think's been noticed recently, and it probably comes down to better reporting, 24-hour news the way we get it nowadays, is that, you know, sadly, and probably because, or possibly because of climate change, there's been a lot more natural disasters than ever before. And that means using a D Incoterm is a lot more risky than it ever has been before, because of floods, because of earthquakes, because of hurricanes, because of natural disasters. So in the past couple of reviews of Incoterms, we've looked at whether we should actually be putting a really strong warning under D group Incoterms. We decided not to do that because we think actually it's up to the contracting parties to think how much risk they're prepared to take. But it's something that's always discussed. And then you get new regulations, things like the VGM regulations. Those of you who ship your metals, your materials, your minerals in containers, in shipping containers, you probably know about the relatively new, when I say relatively new, about 5 years old now, but the relatively new VGM regulation, verification of gross mass. And that means, that regulation you probably know is all about the weight of the cargo in the container. Because now, when you tell the shipping line or the freight forwarder the weight of the metal you put in the container, you're making a legal declaration. And if you get it wrong by just 1 kilo, in theory, you could be prosecuted in the international courts. It's a commitment now, it's now international law, that the weight declared to a shipping line or a freight forwarder or a carrier when cargoes are shipped by container, the weight declared must be absolutely accurate. Okay, that's a new regulation. So that's a responsibility. And we had to look at that and decide, should it be a seller's responsibility under each of the 11 terms or the buyer's responsibility? In the end, we decided it was captured in Incoterms anyway under clause A8. I'll look at the individual clauses later on. But basically, we decided that can only ever be the seller's responsibility. It can never be the buyer's responsibility for obvious reasons. But whenever there's a change like that, we really have to look at if it's going to trigger a change in the terms. So that just gives you an indication of some of the changes that we considered in the review of Incoterms. So before we go on, just shout out to me the term, just take your microphones off mute and just shout out to me the terms that you use or the terms that you've heard of. Don't be shy, just take yourselves off mute and just shout out the terms that you know.
FOB.
Thank you, FOB, yep.
In the chat, there is DAP, DDP, CIF, CIP.
Okay. Any others?
CFR, let me see, there's
Yeah.
that one. DDP, DAP.
DDP, DAP, yep. Anyone else want to shout out
FCA.
some? Go on.
FCA.
FCA, great.
CIP.
CIP, brilliant. Any others? I think we're getting them all.
CPT.
CPT, very good. FAS, another one, not very much used, but FAS is another one. And I think the only one you haven't mentioned is DPU. Anyway, don't worry. I just wanted to warm you up a little bit, but we'll have a look at them individually a bit later on. So why use them? You can hear me passionately banging on about them, and I am passionate about them. So why use them? Why is it so important? And as you can see there, it's all about the word certainty. That's what it comes down to. Certainty in the contract. That's what we're trying to achieve. So what do I mean by certainty? Well, firstly, certainty, and in no particular order of priority, but certainty over who pays what in the supply chain. The biggest number of disputes you get is the buyer says to the seller, you should be paying for that. And the seller says to the buyer, no, you should be paying for that. The answer is really easy. Look it up in Incoterms. The answer will be in Article A9 or B9 for each of the terms. And that's very, very clear what the seller has to pay for and what the buyer has to pay for. No argument, it gives absolute certainty. Then certainty over the delivery point, bearing in mind, if the Incoterm begins with C, we've got 2 delivery points, the legal delivery point, and with the C terms, the goods are legally delivered when they're dispatched, not when they arrive, they're legally delivered when they're dispatched. But the physical delivery point is when they arrive. So we need certainty over the delivery point. And the legal delivery point will also give us certainty at the point of risk transfer from the seller to the buyer. So where does the seller's risk end and where does the buyer's risk start? And there's no gap between them. There's no grey area. There's no gap. Where the seller's risk ends, the buyer's risk begins. So we'll have certainty over the point of risk transfer. It gives us certainty over the responsibilities of the seller and the buyer. In the supply chain, what does the seller have to do and what does the buyer have to do? Because the problem is, we may think the other party is doing it. Who's going to arrange import clearance? We may think, well, the importer is going to do that, but under GDP, that's not the case. So that's just one example. So we need to know who's going to do things. So we get certainty over the responsibilities of the parties. What does the seller have to do and what does the buyer have to do? There are two Incoterms which make insurance compulsory. And the clue is in the I. If the Incoterm's got an I in it, that means it is compulsory to insure the cargo. And those are CIP and CIF. And under Incoterms, we get certainty over the level of cover that has to be provided. We'll look at that later on. So certainty over the minimum insurance cover. Remembering from yesterday that in international trade, the documents represent the goods. So we need to have certainty over when the documents should be passed from the seller to the buyer. Because if the buyer can't get the documents, they can't get the goods. And finally, if it all goes horribly wrong, then we have access to the International Chamber of Commerce Court of Arbitration in the event of a dispute. Now, let me just say a little bit about that. I sat on the Court of Arbitration for a few years, and I can tell you a bit of a story there. The Court of Arbitration, the ICC Court of Arbitration, it's, the thing is, if you've got a dispute, a contractual dispute with your counterparty, you could go to a lawyer, you could go to a national court. It's going to be really expensive. It's going to take a long time to come to a decision. So the International Chamber of Commerce have a Court of Arbitration. And the Court of Arbitration, one of the major things that they look at is implementation or disputes concerning International Chamber of Commerce rules. And the principal set of International Chamber of Commerce rules are, of course, Incoterms. So for a few years, I got a role, and this is a part-time role, on the Court of Arbitration. There are several panels, and I was on one of the panels. And when I was being briefed on the work, I was told that, what happens is there's a contractual dispute between a seller and a buyer. You will be given copies of all the documentation, the contract, and what the dispute is. And then the panel, and I think there were 5 or 6 of us on each panel, and then the panel will discuss it, we'll look at it, and we'll come to a conclusion. And I couldn't really understand it initially, but we were given the briefing on our role in the Court of Arbitration. And at the end of it, the guy who was training us, he basically said, well, very, very often the dispute is heard remotely. But he said, if the parties do want to come to ICC in Paris to have the review heard face to face, and quite a lot of respondents did, if they do want to do that, we do it face to face. And what we were told is if it is a face to face hearing, we should make the hearing last at least 45 minutes. That was the guidance we were given. Make it last at least 45 minutes. And I really didn't understand what the relevance of that was until I started doing it. And then when I started doing it, what I quickly, and other people I think quickly discovered was, actually, this should never have come to the Court of Arbitration. Because all the parties had to do was look at the book, and the answer would be in the book. That's all they had to do. So coming to the Court of Arbitration was really unnecessary, because if they had only got the book and referred to it, the answer would have been there. But because they have to pay to use the Court of Arbitration, we were told make the hearing last at least 45 minutes, so they think they're getting good value for money. I found that quite amusing, but in a way upsetting at the time as well. Okay, so these are the reasons why I use them. to use them. And remember, key takeaways so far, or two key takeaways, there are loads of them, but two key things, is that firstly, do remember that Incoterms govern the contract of sale, not the contract of carriage. They impact on the cost on the contract of carriage, but they govern the contract of sale. That's the first key takeaway. The second key takeaway is do not, well, you can do it if you like. I was going to say, do not Google Incoterms and think you'll get a correct response. There is the biggest load of rubbish on the internet about Incoterms. The only true source is the International Chamber of Commerce. You need to get the book. You can get it in paper format, you can get it virtually from the International Chamber of Commerce. You can actually get a free of charge app, which isn't the full Incoterms. It's a kind of introduction, but there is a free app available, which gives a kind of very, very brief view. But, you know, anyone involved in international trade, you need that book, whether you get it virtually or the paper version. The only true source of Incoterms is the book. And, you know, as I've mentioned, sadly, many organizations do put Incoterms on their website, you know, even government organizations. As I mentioned, the biggest shipping line in the world, and they should get it right, have got Incoterms wrong on their website. It's a very, very big issue. Now, in Incoterms 2020, for those of you who've got the book, you'll know, but there's actually a new section in it. And the new section covers what Incoterms don't deal with. And that's an innovation in Incoterms 2020. And the reason that's there is because there is so much misinformation about Incoterms. So if you look at Incoterms 2020, you will see there's a short chapter on what Incoterms don't deal with, to make sure some of the myths about Incoterms can be completely removed. So firstly, they don't deal with whether a contract exists or not, because they don't know. You can do that. And of course, they can't deal with the specification of the goods for every single product traded. They can't do that. What they do is say that the correct product must be sold. And we'll look at that a bit later on. They don't dictate the time, place, method, or currency of payment. But as I've mentioned earlier, they can have an impact on payment in relation to when an exporter recognizes revenue for a sale. Okay, and they also have to work in terms of document handover from seller to buyer when the documents go to the banking system, for example, with a letter of credit. So, and I've mentioned earlier on, there is a big change in Incoterms 2020, which we'll look at later on. They can't cover remedies for breach of contract because that's going to be different depending on the legislation of the countries concerned. They don't cover most consequences of delay or other breaches of obligation. They can't cover the effect of sanctions. Of course they can't. You wouldn't expect that. Or the imposition of tariffs, very importantly with the situation we have at the moment. You know, and I think, you know, I think the whole point is that when you see how quickly tariffs have been brought in, you know, against the international global rules, that's the kind of reason why Incoterms cannot cover the imposition of tariffs. They can't cover export or import prohibitions and restrictions because, again, every country has the sovereign right to have import and export restrictions. Every country has the right to do that. They don't cover force majeure or hardship. And that's quite interesting because after COVID, this came up a lot where, you know, I had lots of queries from traders saying, why don't Incoterms cover force majeure? Because we were in a position during COVID where we couldn't perform the contract. So, of course, COVID came in after Incoterms 2020. COVID happened in, you know, the lockdown started in most countries around about March 2020. Whereas, of course, Incoterms 2020 came in January 2020. So they didn't cover pandemics. Now, there's a big, and I'm sure we're going to have this discussion for Incoterms 2030. There will be a discussion about whether Incoterms should cover force majeure in the event of something like a pandemic. My personal view is they can't and they won't. I shouldn't preempt that because I'm very open to listening to the discussions. But certainly that's my view at the moment, that the way Incoterms work, they couldn't cover those things. But we'll see. You know, we'll see. There will be a debate on that. Yeah, do we have a question? I can see the initials GO trying to talk. No, okay.
I have a question about force majeure.
Yeah.
It seems so if the seller is responsible for if it is the seller's liability, so say they are under the D group Incoterms. But the force majeure can still impact them. So it might not be their fault. It could be a natural disaster.
Yeah.
Could be anything. Would it not be sensible for Incoterms to cover to either cover force majeure, or could you explain a bit the relationship between Incoterms
Yeah.
and force majeure if such
Yeah.
an incident
Yeah.
happens?
Sure.
So force majeure, to explain, is a term that people can use when they're affected by something they could not foresee, an unforeseeable risk, such as a natural disaster. It could be a war or a revolution. These things come under rule of force majeure that someone can claim for non-performance of contract.
Yeah, thanks, Paulina. Really good point. And the simple answer to that is the issue with that, because it does make sense, doesn't it? The issue there is what is considered to be a force majeure event is different in different countries. That's why it can't cover it. Because, Incoterms can't cover things which can vary from country to country to country. It just wouldn't work. The Incoterms book would be 5,000 pages long because it would have to have legislation from every country. So you couldn't do that. It just wouldn't work. Now, when we did the last review of Incoterms, and this was, and as I've mentioned, COVID did actually bring this to light. And what we did do is we asked the lawyers to have a look at that and say, this is our thinking at the moment, that because legislation is going to be different in different countries, it's going to be really different to incorporate within Incoterms. And, eventually, and they discussed this, the lawyers agreed that. They said you couldn't do that because there would just be too many variations you could have. But I guess, and I'm sure it will be discussed again. I've got no doubt, and it should be discussed again. It really should be. But what it really needs is an international definition of a force majeure event. That's what's needed. And currently, we haven't got that. They talk about something that you couldn't reasonably foresee, but that's interpreted, I just made up that word. It's interpreted in different ways in different countries. So you have a really big issue with that. So until we get an international definition of force majeure, I think it's going to be really difficult to incorporate it. That's the background.
But an Incoterm does not preclude someone from declaring a force majeure if that force majeure is recognized in the jurisdiction under which they're delivering that contract.
Absolutely. And, it's something that should be under jurisdiction. It's something that should be in their contract. Just because it's not covered by Incoterms, it can still be in the contract. So having a force majeure in a contract, nowadays, I think particularly, is probably a very, very good thing to do. It really is a good thing to do. So absolutely, Paulina, separate clause in the contract, that's absolutely fine, but it's not incorporated within the Incoterm governing the contract.
Thank you. Thank you, John.
Brilliant. Thank you. Really good point. Thanks. Intellectual property rights, again, because of different rules in different countries, and again, because it doesn't really, I was going to say it doesn't matter, it's not the right terminology, but, in terms of intellectual property rights, again, that's a legal matter, that should be in the contract, but it's not covered by Incoterms. The method, venue, or law of dispute is going to be by negotiation between the parties. So the jurisdiction contract, yesterday we looked at the content of the contract, there will be a jurisdiction clause, and that's going to show the method, venue, and law of dispute. That will be something negotiated between the parties. And finally, the reason why it's in red is because this is where there's the biggest misconception. Incoterms don't deal with the ownership of the goods. They don't deal with the transfer of property or title. In other words, the transfer of ownership from the seller to the buyer. They can't deal with that. They deal with where the risk passes, and they deal with where the goods are legally delivered, but they don't deal with the transfer of ownership. Again, that's going to be a separate clause in the contract. And very, very often, that's going to be linked with payment. That's normally what's going to happen. very often it's very, very usual that you'll see a retention of title clause in the contract that will say something like ownership of the goods will stay with the exporter, with the seller, until the goods have been fully paid for. So that would be a typical retention of title clause you'd see in the contract. But it's a really important issue. Incoterms do not govern the transfer of property, because where the risk passes from the seller to the buyer, some people think that's where ownership passes, but it doesn't unless the contract allows for that. Okay, so, it sounds like a small thing. Well, maybe it doesn't even sound like a small thing. It's actually quite a big thing. The transfer of ownership is not covered by Incoterms. There's probably going to be a retention of title clause in the contract. It will be covered by a separate clause in the contract. So when we look at the international supply chain, the key thing is there are lots of critical points in the supply chain, even in the most simple supply chain. And there's an example on the screen at the moment. You've got the movement of goods from the seller to the buyer, and you've got all these critical points, 12 or 13 critical points in between. And the key thing here is, don't worry about the individual points, but the point here that I'm making is that at each critical point, and this is a simple supply chain, a very, very simple supply chain, but even in the most simple supply chain, you can have 12 or 13 critical points. At each critical point, something's going to happen. There's going to be an activity, customs clearance, loading a truck, loading a ship, offloading an aircraft, providing documents, weighing the cargo. There's going to be an activity. And for each activity, we need to know which party has the cost of it, the seller or the buyer. Which party has the responsibility for doing it, the seller or the buyer? And if the goods are damaged during the activity, who has the risk, the seller or the buyer? So basically, that's what Incoterms are doing. They're looking at every single part of the supply chain, and they're looking at the division of risk, obligation, and cost between seller and buyer for each of the 11 terms, for each possible activity within a supply chain. Now, Incoterms don't list all the activities because there can be hundreds of them in the complex supply chain, but they tell you where the seller has the risk and the responsibility and where that risk ends, and when the buyer has it and where the risk ends. So we end up with 4 groups of Incoterms, and the groups are designated by the first letter of the term. Okay, so we've got 11 terms, and those terms are subdivided into 4 groups, and each group has a quality about that group. So the first group is Group E. And Group E is very, very straightforward. There's only one Incoterm in Group E. And as I mentioned, we'll look at all the terms individually a bit later on. There's only one Incoterm in Group E, and that's EXWORKS or EXW. Remembering every Incoterm is a 3-letter acronym. So there's only one of them in Group E, EXWORKS or EXW. In the Group E term, the goods are made available to the buyer at the seller's premises. Simple as that. Okay, and remember, the Group E terms are not export terms, they're domestic terms. If you sell under a Group E term, EXW, you are not exporting. You're doing a domestic sale. Okay, EXW, EXWORKS, is not for international trade. Even though people try and use it for international trade, it causes problems. It's not designed for international trade. So that's Group E. In Group F, we have 3 terms, FOB, FAS, and FCA. And with the Group F terms, the seller delivers the cargo to a carrier by sea, by air, by road, by rail, or to a freight forwarder. But the carrier is appointed, contracted, and paid for by the buyer. So with the F group,
John, repeat the 3. John, repeat the 3,
Sure.
please.
Sure. FOB, FAS, and FCA. FOB, we'll look at all the individual
Sorry, again, please. Again, please.
FOB, FAS, and FCA.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Okay, so F group, the seller delivers the goods to a carrier appointed by the buyer. The buyer holds the contract of carriage. Okay, and the risk passes from seller to buyer on dispatch. So the F group terms are generally used when the buyer can get a better freight rate than the seller. That's a bit of a generalization, but it normally holds true. So later on, we'll look at which term to use in different circumstances. But with F group, that's the normal environment. The F group terms will normally be used if the buyer can get a better freight rate than the seller. We then have C group, and there are 4 Incoterms in the C group: CPT, CIP, CFR, and CIF. And the C group terms are very, very similar to F group. The only difference between them is that with the C group terms, the seller arranges, contracts, and pays for the international transportation, but doesn't take the risk of the international transportation. So the only difference between C group and F group is that with the C group, the seller has the contract of carriage, but does not have the risk of carriage. Okay, so the C group terms would normally be used where the seller can get a better freight rate than the buyer. That's normally when the C group terms would be used. But in terms of risk, there is no difference between F group and C group. Risk passes at exactly the same point on dispatch. And with both F group and C group, the goods are legally delivered on dispatch, not on arrival. In terms of legal delivery, F group and C group are identical. The goods are legally delivered when they're dispatched, not when they arrive. We then finally have the D group terms. With the D group terms, and there are 3 of them: DAP, DPU, and DDP. Those are the 3. And with the D group terms, the seller takes all the cost and all the risk required to bring the goods to the place of destination. The seller holds the contract of carriage, and risk only passes from seller to buyer when the goods have arrived at the agreed destination and been receipted by the buyer or by the agent of the buyer. Okay, so with the D group terms, the seller takes all the risk until the receipted arrival of the goods. So with E group, F group, and C group terms, the seller's risk ends on dispatch. But things change considerably when we get to D group. With the D group, the seller's risk ends only when the goods have arrived at final destination and been receipted by the buyer. If they never arrive, or if they do arrive but they haven't been receipted, they have not been legally delivered, and the seller is not entitled to get paid. Okay, so those are the 4 groups: E, F, C, and D. Any questions on that?
I have a question.
Please go ahead.
Currently on discussions on DAP, seller is asking to pay at the dispatch on DAP conditions, while he would like to keep the contract of carriage and to all risks which will be done until the delivery. The only thing what is quite unusual for me, it is the payment at the dispatch.
Yeah.
Could you give me some comments on that and your thoughts?
Sure. Thank you for asking. With DAP, the goods have not been legally delivered until they arrive at destination. So a sensible buyer, if I'm buying from you DAP, I would say I'm not going to give you 1 cent until the goods arrive because you haven't performed the contract of sale until the goods arrive. So if I am a buyer who really understands Incoterms, I'm going to say you're not going to get paid until the goods arrive. Because until they arrive, you haven't legally delivered, and therefore you're not entitled to get paid. Do you see what I mean? So if from the seller's point of view, if the buyer is prepared to pay before the goods arrive, if the buyer's prepared to take that risk, that's entirely up to them. And they may well do, or they may not may well do, so they may do that. You know, they may do it. But the point is, you know, a buyer who's well trained in procurement, they would say to the seller, look, really, really sorry, but you've got the risk until arrival. Okay, that's why we've asked for a D term rather than a C term. We want you to have the risk until arrival. You don't legally deliver until the goods have arrived, until we've got them. So we will pay you when we've got them, but we're not going to pay you before that, because how do we know that you're going to perform the contract of sale? That's what is, you know, that's what a sensible procurement person would say. But, you know, as I say, it may be that they won't even know that, or it may be you can negotiate out of that. It may be the seller can negotiate and say, well, look, at least give us 50% on dispatch. We accept that you don't have to give us the rest until arrival, at least negotiate that. So, you know, frankly, that would all be down to negotiation.
Thank you very much. Yeah,
You're
this
welcome.
is kind of confirmation for my
Yeah.
doubt.
Does that answer your point?
Yeah, yeah.
And I think it's a really good point. And, you know, in practical terms, honestly, most buyers aren't aware that, you know, in law, they would be protected if they insist on not paying until arrival. In law, they would be protected under the Incoterm. Very many buyers don't know that. So, you know, if you're a seller and they're prepared to pay on dispatch, that's great. Let them do it. That's great if they're prepared to have that risk. So thanks for asking that. A really good point. Okay, so we are absolutely, I think, according to my watch, bang on 2:30 UK time, which is the ideal point to have a pause. After the pause, we're going to look at the individual terms one by one. You know, you'll appreciate in the time available, we haven't got time to go to all the details of the 11 terms, but I'll give you an overview of each of the 11 terms after the break. So, just before we break, any questions so far? Okay, so let's have the break now. We'll please reconvene in 30 minutes. That will be UK time 3 o'clock. UK is UTC +1. So wherever you are, if we could please reconvene in 30 minutes, that would be great. Thank you very much for your attention so far.
Thank you, John, and thank you everyone in the seminar. If for any reason during the break you drop out, please drop me an email and I'll send you again the link and you can log back in. Thank you. See you in half an hour.